Today I'm going to be telling you about a recent study of ours that examined the phenomenon of lexically-mediated compensation for coarticulation in a group of older adults. This work was the joint effort of several researchers in the Magnuson lab, and we're really excited to share our results with you. So to a naive viewer, this picture from a 1965 issue of Life magazine might look like a random series of black splotches. But once you know that what you're seeing is a Dalmatian sniffing a sidewalk, here's its head, its body, its legs, and tail, you interpret the same visual input differently. And I think this nicely illustrates a core question for cognitive scientists. How does our knowledge influence our interpretation of the world? Does my knowledge that I'm looking at a Dalmatian actually change my perceptual experience? Or does it merely change my post-perceptual interpretation of what I perceived? There are several analogous examples in the domain of spoken word recognition. So, for instance, if I hear an isolated fricative that's partway between s and sh, I may not be sure what I've heard. But if I hear that same fricative in a context like
Christmas,
I'll be more likely to interpret that final sound as s because Christmas is a word and Christmas is not. And we can ask that same question here. Does our lexical knowledge that Christmas is a word actually change our perception of that final phoneme, or does it merely change our post-perceptual decision about what we heard? Now, in the literature, this question is at the heart of a debate between two kinds of computational models. So in a family known as interactive models, when you activate a word, like Christmas, it directly feeds back to influence the activation of its constituent phonemes. And so it's because of this top-down feedback that the s phoneme gets a boost and you perceive a s at the end of Christmas. Now by contrast, in autonomous models, there is no feedback from words to phonemes. Instead, these two sources of information, word knowledge and phoneme activations, are combined post-perceptually. And so knowing the word Christmas doesn't boost your activation of the phoneme s, it just changes your decision about what phoneme you most likely heard. So the question really is whether we should include top-down feedback in our computational models of spoken word recognition. And one challenge is that many phenomena can be explained by both accounts, making it difficult to adjudicate between them. In this talk, I'll describe two recent sets of findings from our group, one recently published in the journal Cognitive Science, the other described in the proceedings for this year's conference, that suggests that high-level knowledge has a direct top-down influence on perception, with important implications for other domains of cognitive science. Now, before I can describe this phenomenon of lexically-mediated compensation for coarticulation, I first have to tell you about a phenomenon known as compensation for coarticulation. There are some sounds, like t and s, that are usually produced with a front place of articulation, whereas sounds like k and sh are produced relatively far back in the mouth. Now, sometimes a talker has to produce a front sound and then immediately produce a back sound. And when that happens, they may not be able to get to the back of the mouth. Instead, they'll end up producing a sound with a relatively ambiguous place of articulation for their second sound. And so we see an effect of coarticulation, or of adjacent vocal tract gestures influencing one another. In the early 1980s, Mann and Rep demonstrated that listeners are able to compensate for this coarticulation, and they recognized that the ambiguous sound was likely intended to be a sound with a back place of articulation. Now, I'll note that this process can also be described through a general auditory framework, so it doesn't rely on a listener necessarily appealing to their knowledge of the motor implementations for each of these sounds. For our purposes, that specific aspect of the mechanism doesn't matter greatly, but what does matter greatly for our purposes is that this phenomenon is agreed to occur at a sub-lexical level of processing. And so the diagnostic test of whether to include feedback should be to test if lexical knowledge can influence how a sub-lexical process unfolds, and therefore, in order to establish whether there are top-down influences of the lexicon, we should test if lexical knowledge can mediate the process of compensation for coarticulation. So that's exactly what Ellman and McClelland did in the late 1980s. They first presented listeners with an initial context word that ended with an ambiguous phoneme, but critically, lexical context disambiguated it to either be a sound with a front place of articulation, like a s, or a sound with a back place of articulation, like a sh. They then gave listeners a sound that was ambiguous between t and k, and they just asked them which one they heard. And critically, listeners' responses depended on whether the lexical context had disambiguated the initial word as ending with a s or a sh. So if a listener heard
Christmas,
then lexical knowledge would guide them to interpret Christmas as a sound with a front place of articulation, such that if they then heard
tapes,
they would interpret that as having a back place of articulation. Correspondingly, if a listener first heard
Spanish,
context tells them that that ends with a sh, and so they would interpret a subsequent ambiguous sound
tapes,
as starting with a t. So here we're seeing evidence that lexical information changes how compensation for coarticulation unfolds, which could only happen if lexical information influenced phoneme activation directly, not if lexical information only affected a post-perceptual decision about what phoneme you heard. Now, since that initial report, there have been myriad papers looking at this effect, and a large part of why there's been such a back and forth in the literature is because, in general, lexical influences on compensation for coarticulation have been really hard to replicate, which, if you think about it, is maybe not so surprising. Lexically-mediated compensation for coarticulation depends on a confluence of two other phenomena, and if you don't meet either of those preconditions, you can't possibly observe an effect that depends on both of them occurring. We realized that previous studies hadn't done the requisite piloting before testing for lexically-mediated compensation for coarticulation, and so in a recent study, that's exactly what we did. We first conducted a set of pilot experiments and made sure that in our stimuli, we first had evidence that lexical information restored an ambiguous word final phoneme, so like in Christmas. And we also tested to make sure that when we had an unambiguous context stimulus, so Christmas with a clear s at the end, that we would get the expected compensation for coarticulation effect on a subsequent front-back continuum. Only once we found stimuli that satisfied these preconditions did we conduct our experiment as well as a direct replication. So we found the same pattern of results across our two samples, and let me orient you to what you're seeing here. So all of our target items began with a segment from a s-sh continuum, and the x-axes here indicate whether the target began with a front place of articulation, so a s, or a back place of articulation, so here a sh, and 0 indicates the most ambiguous step from that continuum. The y-axis indicates how often participants identify the target stimulus as having a front place of articulation, so making a s response. Now, critically, responses depended on the nature of the context items. So the context items always ended with an ambiguous place of articulation, but if the implied place of articulation for that last phoneme was back, as in maniac or questionnaire, then listeners were more likely to identify the first segment of the target as having a front place of articulation. And if the implied place of articulation for the context item was front, as in isolate or pocketful, then listeners were more likely to say that the target began with a back place of articulation. So visually, the effect that we're looking for here, and in all the plots that I'll show you today, is a clear separation of these two lines, with the blue line above the orange line. So in our second study, which is described more fully in the conference proceedings, we wanted to extend our previous study and specifically ask how these LCfC effects might change as a function of age. Now, the case of older adults, I think, is particularly interesting, One, because sensory processing is often impaired in older adults, and two, because there's also evidence that older adults may rely relatively more strongly on lexical knowledge than their younger peers. And so we therefore speculated that LCfC effects might actually be larger in a sample of older adults compared to a younger cohort. And so our study involved two experiments, the first of which we pre-registered on the Open Science Framework. Here we're analyzing 40 adults who are 65 and older, and we're conducting a direct replication of our previous study. Now, due to COVID restrictions on in-person data collection, we conducted our study online, and all participants were required to pass a headphone screening test before their data could be included. Again, we're expecting that LCfC might be even more pronounced in older adults than in younger adults. So here are the data, the older adults at the right and the younger adults from our previous study at the left for comparison. And you'll note that the results look nearly identical. We're seeing robust lexically-mediated compensation for coarticulation in both groups. And we quantified the effect size by comparing how often participants made a front place of articulation response after hearing context items with an implied back place of articulation compared to context words with an implied front ending. The effect was numerically but not statistically larger in the older adults. We also found that older adults were numerically but not statistically slower to respond than their younger peers. So we're really struck by the fact that we're seeing robust LCfC effects in older adults as well. To our knowledge, this is the first time that LCfC has been examined in a sample of older adults, and these findings, I think, therefore speak to the generalizability of the results from our first study. But as we considered these data, we also wondered if our ability to observe an interaction might be limited because of the fact that we have relatively few observations in the ambiguous region of the continua, right? So we don't expect to see context effects at the most extreme steps, so here steps -2 and +2, and so we decided to also conduct a second experiment where we would look at a narrower range of steps for our target continua. So in our second experiment, which wasn't pre-registered, we're using a more limited range of the continuum. Rather than using whole step increments from steps -2 to +2, we are using an equivalent number of half-step increments, still centered on that most ambiguous step. Now here we had 40 young adults and 40 older adults whose data we're analyzing, and we followed the same recruitment procedures as before. For this second study, however, we're analyzing data from older adults who are 60 and up, as opposed to 65 and up in our previous experiment, since we were having some difficulty recruiting older adults 65 and up here. And so here are the results. You'll note that we're looking at a more limited range of the y-axis in these plots, since in general responses were closer to chance, likely because participants never heard the clear endpoints from the target continua. And as before, we're seeing clear evidence for LCfC in both groups. The blue lines are above the orange lines, with no significant difference in the size of the effect. Again, older adults showed a numerically larger effect, and they were numerically slower, but neither of those differences was significant. So to conclude, the results from our new study show that lexically-mediated compensation for coarticulation can be observed in a sample of older adults, which to our knowledge hasn't been shown before. These results provide additional support for computational models that include top-down feedback. Now, strikingly, we didn't find any statistically significant differences in our effects as a function of age, but we note that our ability to do fine-grained measures of sensory processing was limited since our study was conducted online, so it would therefore be informative to extend these results to in-person samples. We also note that our ability to see an interaction with age might be limited due to potential ceiling effects in the use of lexical knowledge. Both young adults and older adults have strong lexical knowledge, and future work could therefore evaluate the extent of LCfC in situations where listeners don't rely strongly on lexical knowledge, whether in children or in adults learning novel words. Overall, we think the current results are interesting for the ways in which they highlight what's common between young adults and older adults, and we think this provides further evidence for our claim that top-down feedback may be a core tenet of cognitive science. With that, I would like to thank our funding sources for their support, as well as you for your time.